Okay, while folks are settling, I am going to introduce, I have the pleasure of introducing our second chair, who is Dr. Sarah Rahmana, who is an assistant professor of history at Morgan State University and the author of the forthcoming book, The Future is Feminist, Women and Social Change in Interwar Algeria, that will be out with Cornell University Press. Among many other accomplishments, her writing has appeared in both academic and popular spaces, including Gender and History in the Washington Post. She's also a former fellow at the Library of Congress's Page Center. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I have the pleasure of chairing our next panel. First one, wow, that was so good, right? It was really gave me so much to think about. So this panel is called Maritime Spaces and Global Mobilities. And maritime spaces are often conceptualized as barriers that separate or as conduits that connect the Middle East, North Africa, and sub-Saharan African regions. And this panel asks, how significant are such questions to the types and tenor of interrelation between these regions, and how have these interrelations and their relative significance changed historically? So we have three esteemed scholars with us, and of course, Lala Khalili, as well as our discussant. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to actually introduce them before each talk, as opposed to all at once. So we'll start with Matthew Hopper, who is a professor of history at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. His book, Slaves of One Master, Globalization and Slavery in Arabia in the Age of Empire, came out with Yale University Press in 2015 and was a finalist for the 2016 Frederick Douglass Book Prize. He received his PhD in history from UCLA and has had fellowships at Yale, the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, and Cambridge. His writing has been published in Annals, Itinerario, and the Journal of African Development. He's currently writing a history of liberated Africans in the Indian Ocean world.
Thank you very much. I'll just echo my colleagues in thanking the organizers and everybody who handled the logistics of the conference, as well as our chair and discussant. When the HMS Osprey steamed into Aden Harbor on the 17th of September, 1888 to deliver 204 liberated Africans who had been captured the previous day in the Red Sea near Mocha, responsibility fell to the assistant political resident, Edward Vincent Stace, to oversee the captives' disposal, and this is the term used in the 19th century, among the residents of the city. The Osprey's commander, Charles Gissing, deemed the captures a success, although he regretted that because the three dhows had failed to stop after blanks were fired across their bows, he was obliged to fire live rounds, which killed 4 of the African captives, as well as the captain of one of the ships, and wounded another 4 Africans. Kilu, a 16-year-old boy, received a bullet wound through his chest. Bahaza, a 12-year-old boy, received a bullet wound through muscles beneath the spine of right scapula. Torunga, a 12-year-old girl, suffered a bullet wound to the head, superficial, it was listed as in parentheses. And Sayena, who was a 10-year-old girl, received a bullet wound in her right arm, also superficial. Within 5 days of the Osprey's arrival, Stace had posted a notice in the city, which read in Arabic, "Attention, the recently captured slaves now in Aden will be distributed to those wishing to take them." And this is Colonel Stace. And here is the report from Gissing listing the capture of the dhows, as well as the injuries sustained by Africans on board. And here is a group of those captives. The phrase "recently captured" appears to have been an afterthought. Stace inserted later using a caret above the original sentence in his draft, which began simply with "the slaves." And the sign went on to say that Europeans who were married and approved could take boys and girls who were both Christian and Muslim. Unmarried Europeans could take boys. Married, quote, natives could take Muslim boys or girls as servants, although Stace made clear to clarify to be free, no longer slaves, until able to take care of themselves. Unmarried and approved natives could take Muslim boys as servants and could take Muslim girls in marriage if marriageable age and with the girl's consent. Applications were to be made to the assistant resident. And within days, proposals began to flood in. Local elites and missionaries and government officials sent very polite petitions to states expressing reasons that they should be permitted to take a certain number of liberated Africans. Applicants included the police inspector, the postal commissioner, and a prominent local photographer, A.C. Gomez, who would later become Zanzibar's most famous photographer. And Gomez received a 10-year-old girl named Tarunga, Tigo, from among that early group. And he signed a bond bearing an Indian government and a stamp, pledging to maintain, feed, and clothe, and otherwise treat kindly the girl until she reached the age of 21. So here is Long Island, or becomes known as Slave Island in the harbor of Aden. This is where these liberated Africans, as they're called, quarantined. And this is the notice that Stace posted publicly in Aden. Dr. Alexander Patterson of the Free Church of Scotland Mission requested that Stace let him have, quote, the first selection of boys and girls, as it's very important that we secure the youngest and healthiest for his mission. He wrote again to confirm that the mission would like to take 50 boys and 25 girls, to which Colonel Stace replied, you evidently believe the last shall be first and the first shall be last. I will try to do my best for you, but you really are the last. The Catholic mission long ago offered to take 100. I think 1 by 1 choice is the fairest, as was done at the stables in Bombay. Roman Catholic will pick a boy and then you one, and so on. And Stace then began to call in. Incidentally, this is interesting. I thought that Stace used a translator, but apparently Stace also wrote a vocabulary himself. And so it may be possible that he actually wrote out the original notice in his own hand. The bishop replied that Stace called on the Roman Catholic bishop, who was conversant in Ethiopian languages of the captives, to help him prevent from inadvertently consigning Christian children to, quote, Mohammedan masters. The bishop then replied that the Christian boys would have been circumcised at 7 days after birth and the Mohammedan boys at 7 years. So all who are not circumcised are pagan, end quote. At this, Stace sent his assistant to ascertain the religious affiliation of 16 boys whose identities had been unclear in their initial interviews. When the assistant sent a note apologizing for the delay in obtaining information on account of some girls not being forthcoming, Stace fired back a missive in haste. I don't know what you have to do examining the girls. I said very plainly, I wish you simply to see about the religion of 16 of the boys, nothing more. You had nothing to do with the rest, as I did those myself. Soon afterwards, Stace circulated a memo that said the following applicants may attend at the pilgrimage sheds near Mu'alla on Saturday at 5 p.m. to select slaves. And 50 liberated Africans who were sent to the Scottish Free Mission would later be transferred to the mission's church mission at Lovedale Industrial School in South Africa, minus the 9 who died in the first year. And this group is, by the way, part of a study, a really fascinating study by Sandra Schell with Ohio University Press called Children of Hope. So Stace distributed the remainder of the captives among those local officials and missionaries. And you can see here his register explaining to whom each of these liberated Africans was consigned. By 1888, the Royal Navy's anti-slave trade campaign in the Indian Ocean had entered its 80th year, and the capture of slave vessels and the distribution of liberated Africans had become a matter of well-rehearsed routine. The first slave ships captured by the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean actually dated back to 1808, the first year of the Act of Abolition's enforcement. And by 1888, an estimated 20,000 liberated Africans had been landed at 10 port cities from Cape Town to Bombay. Aden was itself no stranger to liberated Africans. The first of them arrived back on the HMS Penguin back in 1865, and 2 separate groups, 108 in April and then 141 in May. By the end of 1866, the city had received 1,452 liberated Africans. But the callous treatment directed toward liberated Africans at Aden in 1888 had been developing gradually over decades and over the course really of a century-long anti-slave trade campaign in the Indian Ocean as well as in the Atlantic. The British anti-slave trade campaign in the Indian Ocean went through 2 phases. The first one from 1808 to 1858, which was directed primarily towards Southern Africa. and the Mascarene Islands. And then the second phase beginning around 1858 and continuing till the end of the campaign in 1896 or 1897, focused primarily on East Africa and Arabia, and involved almost exclusively the capture of Arab dhows adjudicated at places like Zanzibar, Aden, and the Cape of Good Hope. And ships during the first phase yielded approximately 9,000 liberated Africans, and another 13,000 would be captured after 1858. In this broader project, I explore how after about 1858, empathy diminished and callousness increased in the treatment of liberated Africans. And this coincided with a decline in abolitionist enthusiasm in Britain and a growth of biological racism and a rise in mid-century disillusionments that discouraged optimism among abolitionists at home and naval and colonial officials about the prospects of liberated Africans. By the 1888 capture by the HMS Osprey, the abolitionist ideals of freedom and equality had yielded to expedience and pessimism, and the callousness exhibited toward liberated Africans at Aden had become commonplace. In this paper, I explore the lives of liberated Africans at Aden between 1861 and 1897. I argue that callous treatment at the hands of colonial officials, missionaries, and naval authorities reflected a growing pessimism about the whole prospect of liberation of the enslaved Africans in the Indian Ocean and the growing effects of scientific racism. I'll show you a few more images. A.C. Gomez took a number of photographs. It'd be fascinating to explore in detail whether the liberated African girl who's consigned to Gomez actually ends up accompanying her to Zanzibar. That is possible, and she may even be one of the subjects of one of these famous photographs in the Winterton collection. The 50 liberated Africans who were given to the Scottish Free Mission are handed over to Lockhead and Patterson, who are reclining here in the front. And remember the name Matthew Lockhead, I'll mention him at the end. He's depicted reclining here on the left. They are the subject of this book by Sandy Shell called Children of Hope. And here are a couple more images of that mission. So in the paper, I'm looking almost exclusively at liberated Africans sent to 2 missions and industrial schools. And the full version is online, but I focus on the Free Scottish Mission, which ends up being transferred to Lovedale, as well as a Catholic mission and industrial school for girls. This is the Keith Falconer mission or school, an image from Sandy Shell's book. And here again is Lockhead depicted on the far right, reclining alongside liberated Africans. After 1865, with a growing number of captures north of the equator along the coasts of today's Kenya, Somalia, and southern Arabia, Aden became the primary destination of liberated Africans captured in the Indian Ocean. The Vice Admiralty Port at Aden opened in July of 1861, but it wasn't really until 1865 when the Admiralty Port was permitted to receive liberated Africans. I'll show you a few more images here. The broader project I'm looking at starts in 1808 with the Act of Abolition, and it's a relatively minor chapter in the story of liberated Africans around the Atlantic and Indian Ocean world. About 200,000 Africans are taken off of slave ships in the course of the 19th century, and about 30,000 of them, between 20 and 30,000, are in the Indian Ocean. Most of the captures are ships that look like this, the Atlantic. They're primarily taken here to Sierra Leone for populations that are primarily from West Africa. But you'll also notice there are people from Southeast Africa who end up caught up in the slave trade, who are also taken to places around the Indian Ocean, including Aden. And this is summarized in a book which was published in 2020 by Anderson and Lovejoy. I've got the Indian Ocean chapter in there. So this is the region that I'm looking at. I'm looking at sites primarily focused here in Southeast Africa, and I'm looking at places like Mauritius and the Cape of Good Hope, as well as Aden. Ships that are captured in the Royal Navy's celebrated anti-slave trade campaign in the late 19th century. Images like this photograph here from the National Maritime Museum of dhow actually being captured in Zanzibar Harbor, and images of ships that washed on shore were commonly depicted throughout the 19th century. These cases would be adjudicated at Vice Admiralty courts at places like Zanzibar, Aden, and Mauritius, as well as the Cape of Good Hope, and then liberated Africans would be taken to places such as the Seychelles. At each of these sites, they would be enumerated in registers. This is a register from Mauritius, and some of these are quite detailed, including individual marks, tattoos, and facial scarification that can be helpful in identifying people's origins. And then they're always indentured. I've never found a record of a ship in which people are asked where they're from and then they're returned there. They're always indentured to British subjects for periods of 7 to 14 years. So in the course of this book project, I've been trying to trace all of the captures, and there are they're well into the hundreds of captured ships, and then figure out where they're sent to be adjudicated, but then ultimately where liberated Africans end up. And depending on the year, they can sometimes be concentrated on particular locations, for example, 1863 with Mauritius. But then the subject of the broader paper for this conference is on Aden, where large numbers of liberated Africans are taken, particularly in the late 60s. Excuse me. But the numbers are so large that many are then subsequently transferred to Bombay. And what I look at in this paper are the stories of liberated Africans who were taken to Aden. This is just one of 10 locations. But I'm interested to explore what their lives are like on these Christian missions. So I'm looking at the Good Shepherds Convent, as well as the Scottish Free Mission. And I'm interested to identify how liberated Africans in Aden perceive themselves in relationship to other African populations within Aden, as well as other populations generally, how liberated Africans were incorporated into Aden society, as well as the role of anti-Black racism within late abolitionism. And so I'll just conclude by reading my conclusion here, that the treatment of liberated Africans, as well as by imperial officials, missionaries, and naval officers, reflected the perceptions that were actively shaped by debates about human difference back home in Europe. New scientific theories of race became entangled with colonial encounters, including the Indian Mutiny, perceived failure of abolition in the Caribbean, the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, to shape perceptions of what kinds of people should be entitled to freedom. And late abolitionism struggled to reconcile the optimism of earlier radical Enlightenment and abolitionist ideals of freedom and equality with growing concerns about the effectiveness of abolition. So Patrick Scanlon has shown from its inception, British abolitionism was much more conservative and more imperial in its geography and ambitions than is conventionally assumed. Abolitionists behind the backed abolition and the creation even of Sierra Leone envisioned a kind of liberty, he argues, that preserved the social order and presumed that people released from the slave trade would remain under the control of their liberators. After all, as Scanlon reminds us, the kneeling slave in Wedgwood's famous cameo did not ask, "Am I an equal?" Anti-slavery in Sierra Leone, as well as in places in the Indian Ocean, was unabashedly profit-seeking, and the treatment of liberated Africans was defined by the debts that Britons assumed that they owed to the British Empire in exchange for their freedom. Late abolitionism differed in some tangible ways from earlier antecedents. As Andrew Porter has observed, various mid-century developments combined to erode the earlier general optimism about non-Western people's capacity to undermine support for the relatively generous approach of things like the abolition in the Caribbean in 1837. I'll just conclude by showing you a few images from ships captured around Aden that were popularized in newspapers like the London Illustrated News and in Sullivan's books about dhow catching in the Indian Ocean, alongside the originals taken by the captain of the ship, the HMS Daphne. And I just want to conclude by showing you one last image from the Scottish Free Mission. In the process of doing this, I've been tracking the actual voyages and including the details of people who die at sea. Not all people who are taken aboard a slave ship actually arrive at the port of adjudication. Some, as a woman who's depicted in this from the records from the Admiralty AMD 53 series, departed this life, one woman slave committed the body to the deep, happened at this location. And so I've been trying to chart this as well as the places where people ultimately were taken. And it is possible that Pedro Pilecua, famous from Malawi, may have actually been aboard the HMS Griffin at the time of those captures in 1888. He is one of many of the liberated Africans who are forced to labor aboard some of these Royal Navy vessels, including the HMS Ready. So I'll just conclude with this image from Sandy Shell's book. Sandy Shell was a clever researcher who noticed that Matthew Lockhead is depicted in the center of this group here. But he's dismissed about 4 years after this photograph for what's listed very vaguely as gross immorality among the liberated Africans. And you can see that he has been carefully omitted out of the history of Lovedale Mission. The same photograph, he's actually been literally removed with a razor blade and replaced by the founder of the Lovedale Mission for their centennial. And I wish that I could say that this were an aberration, but at each of the sites, the 10 sites I'm looking at, I find that some of these European missionaries who are drawn to work with liberated Africans, probably some of the most vulnerable people on earth, having been displaced initially and being enslaved, and then being displaced a second time by the capture of the slave vessel that they're on, are often abusive. And so I've got evidence from Mauritius, from the Seychelles, and Zanzibar, as well as Mombasa, of often very well-intentioned missionaries coming, but then also engaging in these really abusive practices. And this seems to also, unfortunately, even be the case from this original group from 1888, from Lovedale. On that pessimistic note, I'll end to our next speaker.
Thank you. So we'll move on now to Professor Jatin Dua, who is an associate professor of anthropology and director of the interdepartmental program in anthropology and history at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. His research explores maritime mobility in the Indian Ocean, its perils and possibilities. He is the author of Captured at Sea, Piracy and Protection in the Indian Ocean. And his current research projects continue this emphasis on maritime worlds and their entanglements with law, sovereignty, economy, and sociality through two main projects on choke points and board making in the Indian Ocean, and a research project on the lives of seafarers from the global south. His paper today is called Stuck, Choke Points and Immobility in the Indian Ocean.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. It's a true pleasure to be here. And thank you to the organizers for bringing together so many scholars whose work has really shaped how I think about oceanic mobility, and also thanks to Christian for all the logistical work. As someone who's going to be talking about logistics is primarily about slowdown, stuckness. This has certainly not been the case here, so thank you. Yeah. To begin with, perhaps one this was 2 years ago, but a famous image of stuckness. Things get stuck at sea all the time. Sometimes they end up blocking the canal, like the Suez Canal, like the Ever Given did in 2000 and in March of 2021. The Taiwanese-owned Panamanian flagged container ship that was traveling from Malaysia to the Netherlands got stuck in the Suez. For almost a week, the 220,000-ton ship managed to completely block traffic in the Suez, where roughly 12% of global trade transits on a regular basis. This created a traffic jam of over 400 vessels and billions of dollars worth of cargo, ranging from sheep to oil, and thousands of seafarers were all stuck on both sides of this vital choke point that connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. After several days of intensive dredging, a nonstop work by a fleet of tugboats, the Ever Given finally was unstuck on March 29th, though promptly impounded by Egyptian authorities as the negotiated damages from the owners of the ship. So the Ever Given is one particular moment in a broader series, and something that has become increasingly common, of what I call choke point anxieties. The fact that there are these narrow straits, ports, and other geographic locales that choke or seemingly slow down the seemingly frictionless flow of global shipping. Choke points have been understood primarily by policymakers as sites of anxiety and logistical challenges that need to be overcome. And slowdowns always have to be worked through, and things must speed. These are places where flow can be blocked, creating backlogs, as the Ever Given highlighted, that ripple across the world. For many scholars, including the wonderful work of Laleh Khalili, this has been useful for thinking about a critical study of logistics, in which understanding the ways that labor can resist capital and foregrounding the conceits of frictionless global mobility. So the work of Charmaine Chua, Deb Cohen, Lale, and others has really highlighted the ways that this imagined sort of frictionless world of shipping is in fact produced through these deep frictions of labor and the racialized ways in which labor and mobility work at sea. Beyond anxiety or possibility, choke points are dense spaces of circulation. They are amphibious locales where landed forms of territoriality abut the fluidity of the maritime realm. Choke points foreground slowness, stuckness, and interruption. They make palpable the tensions of moving across scale and temporality. And I'm struck, not stuck, maybe stuck, by this image of the 20 contemporary busiest ports in the world, and some of this resonates with our previous panel on this mode of like what was US empire and what comes next, in a way to paraphrase the anthropologist Catherine Bergery on state socialism. But there's in a 14th century catalog of trading emporias, one sees the majority of the trade was very much centered towards Asia. And in a way that read some of these same places, others, some new ones appear. But if you look at the contemporary, like top 20 ports today, with the exception of Hamburg, Rotterdam, Antwerp, LA, most of the ports again seem to be shifting towards what we would understand as like inter-Asia or the global South. And part of in this new project, and I ask, like, how do we understand these two moments, and how do we understand the space that was between the 15th century and beyond? Was that an interruption? Was that, is the world returning to some kind of order, but more as a provocation, but to think rather about what happens when we follow some of these itineraries as they move from Rotterdam to, in the book, to Port Kelang, and then eventually Singapore. And so this is to understand the ways that logistics gets stitched together as ships, people, goods move slowly, but nonetheless continue moving forward. So I'm interested also in the generative ways in which places like ports and these other kinds of choke points make visible what is happening at sea. So by focusing on a series of port spaces and shipping lanes in the Bab el-Mandeb, a narrow strait that separates Africa from Asia and connects the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, part of the book makes visible the linkages that tie together a variety of boats, from container ships to fishing skiffs. Instead of domaining the world into discrete conceptual categories of logistics, diasporic trade networks, and migration, which are the three realms where I often see conversations around boats at sea appearing, I ask what happens when we bring these together, when the choke point is an argument for a methodological and conceptual co-presence. Beyond the problem of lag and vestige of prior times, this paper and the larger project from which it stems wants to understand the constitutive and contingent power of choke point politics, a mode of politics and placemaking built on channeling. And so this is kind of the high density of global shipping, and part of, and so these are basically AIS maps that are available online. You click on each, they tell you itineraries of ships, where they're going, where they're headed. And of course, these itineraries map onto and resonate with much older histories of movement and mobility, often similar ports appearing and disappearing. But at the same time, the sea is not just a space of trade, it is the securitized space. So part of co-presence is also an argument for thinking together these different, seemingly different forms of visualizing and map making at sea, and how they, including the ways that currents, monsoons, and various non-human companions travel alongside ballast water and things like that. And so what makes circulation circulate? And I want to begin with Djibouti, which is port right at the doors of the Bab el-Mandeb. And I intersperse some of this with my own fieldwork on board container ships. Soon after we entered the high-risk area in the Gulf of Aden, the bridge becomes a noisier place. On a fairly regular basis, the radio would crackle alive and numerous naval vessels that were patrolling the area would hail a cargo ship, asking for location, crew number, and next port. This was ostensibly done to ensure that a ship was still under the control of its captain and crew and had not been hijacked. We were traveling in an informal convoy through this region. And when I was sitting up with the ordinary seaman, the OS on watch that night, who was telling me that on his last transit, ships were still escorted by Navy vessels. But with private security, those requirements had been loosened. In the middle of our conversation, a voice boomed through the radio. Coalition warship to CMA-CGM Leo. Our ship was being hailed. Elvin, the third mate, had been updating navigation maps on the back, and he ran to the front and answered, "This is CMA-CGM Leo." After a brief pause, the voice came in again. "Switch to channel 7. Once on this private channel, a somewhat scripted back and forth ensued. Coalition warships, so this is the naval coalitions that continue to patrol this region. In this case, it was a Saudi Arabian ship. "How many crew members are on board?" The third mate said. 35 crew plus 1 passenger and armed guard escorts. "Nationalities on board?" The third mate replied. 18 Filipinos, 7 Romanians, 10 Indians, 4 British, who were the mercenaries, and 1 American passenger. "Nationalities on board?" The third mate looked towards me and said, "They're confused why we have an American on board," before repeating the numbers again. "Next port, Djibouti. Thank you, Leo. Safe transit." So this scripted thing is a mode of establishing presence, but also in a way brings to it. Speaking of delay, we haven't even gotten to our first port yet. So we'll skip, but in a way, thinking back to our previous panel on like what are the visible and invisible ways in which power and empire and the multiple forms of imperial presence can be felt, and like these radio moments are these brief moments where things become legible. So I'm interested in kind of how do we feel, how do we sense imperial power at sea, and I think this resonates also with Matt's work in the kind of these moments of like slave trading, the slave chasing, the Dao chasing books, which were also about these kind of controls. So what do we do with the kind of uncanny, the ways that history seems to constantly always resonate? And what I find interesting about this map, in addition to being kind of about high risk area, here you have oil pipeline, so it will tell you also where to avoid underwater cables, which are the internet cables, and how to avoid them so that not to anchor there. And then we get to our port, which is the port of Djibouti, where I've spent a lot of time working in, which is a garrison entrepot, as the anthropologist Janet Reutman would prefer. Alongside being one of the major port of calls, it is also a military base, and for numerous present along, in addition to the French and the Americans who've been there the longest, there are also the UAE, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran, which is more than Assad. And one of the ways that these imperial presences become legible is again in this geography, the Rue de Marseille. There's ties to French Empire, but also always tied to Maersk and Safmarine. These were the offices that I worked in. And I realized very quickly that alongside the French, like other military presences also make themselves legible, sometimes through street names, other times through the gifting of various kinds of public services throughout the city. So there's a language of like, this is a gift from the people of Turkey. There's the central square in Place de Menelik is the fountain there is a gift from Turkey. The UAE has a revolving restaurant, and all of these are gifts to Dubai. And this language of gift, this language of, as well as a language of friendship, in this case, former friendship, appears throughout. So that what I'm trying to understand in Djibouti is how places get made and unmade through forms of gifting, through kinship, through these very kinds of modes of, the stuff of, in fact, old school ethnography, and to see them not just as ways that that obfuscate some kind of real power relation, but rather are modes of securitizing various kinds of infrastructural and logistical projects. So here is the Abdurrahman Bore, and with the current president, Ismail Omar Gule, at the inauguration of one of the dry ports. And Abdurrahman Bore was a representative of the Dubai Port Worlds. At some point has a very public fallout with Omar Gule, includes like a Twitter fallout where they claim no longer to be friends, and then returns, disappears to Dubai, which is where his maternal family is from, and then returns to Somaliland in Bosaso in order to build a new Djibouti on the Red Sea. And so part of it is trying to understand how these forms of imperial presence have to negotiate or use the language of kin making, and here is the Chinese naval base, where also when I was there, this was very much the kind of main event in Djibouti, and at the inauguration of the base, the Chinese ambassador presents this famous the Zhanghe's giraffe, which is in fact a kind of misnomer because it's imagined as this giraffe from Malindi in Kenya being gifted to the Emperor of China, which appears repeatedly throughout Chinese investment practices as a way of saying, like, we have been here before and our presence is no longer, don't call this a new Cold War, a new empire, this is an earlier return. And I'm interested in the ways that history appears and disappears in ports like Djibouti, but also in a place like Bosaso, where we have the stitching together of different temporalities. In this case, the temporalities of Hajj, as well as Eid al-Adha, and the kind of livestock that moves back and forth through the livestock license. And in the paper, I talk more about the kinds of ways that the world that livestock and quarantines create in making a port, in bringing dhows from Gujarat to Somalia, and that bring alongside other kinds of things. And then we end back in Dubai, and maybe I'll briefly read the conclusion. Moving between a number of vessels as they come into view in ports and on shipping lanes across the Bab el-Mandeb, I've sought to think through a politics and form of placemaking that emerges through channeling circulation, in opposition to an imaginary and politics of mobility that is structured within binaries of flow or blockage, or within an unfolding of time that moves from sail to steam to container. Choke points open up to possibilities that emerge from constriction, slowdown, and from suddenness or the surprise. Choke points wax and wane. They emphasize these contingent and surprising ways as they undo forms of conceptual and temporal domain. Providing a corrective to land-centered writing that dominate the studies of political authority in the Horn of Africa and beyond, choke points reveal forms of polity and sociality that are amphibious and emerge through claims over circulation, as opposed to territory or population. Instead of a progressive tale that moves from one epoch to another, choke point circulations are recursive and loopy and necessarily open-ended. Echoing W.E.B. Du Bois's reflections on progress in a semi-autobiographical moment where he asks in The Soul of Black Folks, and all this life and love and strife and failure, is it the twilight of nightfall or the flush of some faint dawning day? Choke point circulations to pose this question of whether we are witnessing twilight or dawn. Thank you.
And next up, we have Professor Ranisa Mawani. who is a Canada Research Chair in Colonial Legal Histories and Professor of Sociology at the University of British Columbia, located on the unceded territories of the Musqueam peoples. She works at the intersection of critical theory and colonial legal history and has published widely on law, colonialism, and legal geography. She is the author of Colonial Proximities out in 2009 and Across Oceans of Law in 2018, which was a finalist for the UK Socio-Legal Studies Association Theory and History Book Prize and winner of the Association of Asian American Studies Book Prize for Outstanding Contribution to History. And her paper for today is entitled Enemies of Empire.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and especially to Christian for saving me. So I have to say, as I was preparing for this event, I was not very sure how my work really fit into this conference, not because of imaginary divides, which I'm very much engaged with, but because of the Middle East. And so I was really thrilled to hear the papers this morning, in part because I was born in Kenya, and so there were so many sort of resonances around the kinds of political issues that people raised. And I'm, of course, so deeply grateful to be on a panel with people that I admire and whose work is so central to my own thinking. So irrespective of whether my work is relevant or not, I'm really pleased to be here.
It is.
So I'm taking you to the other side of the Indian Ocean. And my talk really focuses on my new book project, Enemies of Empire, Commerce and Confinement in Colonial India, Burma, and Siam. And this book, which is very much in its early stages, I've been working on it for 5 years. So I don't know how much longer I can keep saying this, but it is in its early stages, and it's taking me to regions that I'm still learning about. Centers on the Ingress into India Ordinance and the Foreigners Ordinance. So the Ingress was actually signed by the Indian colonial government on September 12, 1914, in anticipation of the arrival of the Komodata Maru, the ship here. A British-built and Japanese-owned steamship, which was to drop anchor on the Huju River, and it was chartered by Gurbit Singh. It carried 376 passengers, mostly from Punjab, and he took the ship from Hong Kong to Vancouver in May 1914. It was essentially the only 20 of the 376 passengers were allowed to disembark. And then the ship was sent back to India. And basically, most of the passengers had never actually touched down on land for a 6-month period. So the colonial government was really worried about the arrival of the ship and hastily signed the Ingress into India Ordinance. So my most recent book, Across Oceans of Law, traces the ship's voyage and discusses the Ingress and the Foreigners Ordinance only briefly. Signed during the first 2 months of World War I, the Ingress was aimed at political dissidents and revolutionaries, mostly from Punjab, who were returning to India and Burma from the west coast of Canada and the United States, and from East and Southeast Asian parts of Khal. So the Ingress, which came into effect 1 week after the Foreigners Ordinance and was used interchangeably, granted colonial authorities, Indian police, and local magistrates unprecedented power to arrest and detain anyone arriving by land or sea and suspected of engaging in seditious activities while abroad. So basically everybody who was returning from Canada, the US, and from Japan and places in China and Southeast Asia. And although the ship was a response to, although the ordinance was a response to a ship of returning migrants from Punjab, the sweeping powers that it engendered were justified through the onset of World War I. And during its 7.5-year life from 1914 to 1921, the ordinance was enforced against thousands of Indian men and some women in Punjab, Bombay, Bengal, Gujarat, Madras, and Burma. And my current research suggests that the Ingress and the Foreigners Ordinances were also used against merchants and traders in Burma, Siam, East and South Africa. So Enemies of Empire offers a genealogy of the Ingress into India Ordinance and the Foreigners Ordinance by focusing on a single case involving 4 Muslim brothers, Sidi, Umair, Muhammad, and Ismail Qasim, who were arrested in 1917 in Burma and Siam, imprisoned and eventually detained in their village in Jetpur, Gujarat. The men were mutwas, or cattle breeders and herders, who traced their lineage to Qurayshi Arabs whose ancestors arrived and settled in Sindh. And for various reasons, they moved from Sindh to Gujarat. The men were not fully released until 1920. So I use this case to frame the book and to tell an intimate, familial, and intergenerational legal history of the Ingress and the Foreigners Ordinances, to trace the circulation of law across land and sea, to examine the legal categories that these ordinances created and the conditions of confinement in India, Burma, and perhaps most importantly, how these ordinances devastated families and futures in India and beyond. So this is the sort of scope of the book. And today I want us to focus on the last point, which is, the work that's been done on the Ingress is really focused on at the level of, statistics that 3,000 men were imprisoned in such and such year. But what I'm really interested is focusing on the micro, on these very sort of small scale traders, to think about the ways in which these ordinances really devastated families. And I'm also, the book is also an engagement with the amphibious. So I was really excited by Jethro's paper, because I'm really interested in how this maritime ordinance was actually used in the mountainous regions in the border between Burma and Siam, and the ways in which it connected land and sea, littoral to mountainous regions and border towns in efforts to capture radicals and merchants through the criminalization of commerce. So I want to just say something about the protagonists of this story, who I originally thought were related to me because my mother's family name is Sidi and my father's family name is Qasim, but it turns out. On August 3rd, 1917, Sidi Qasim, a 21-year-old merchant originally from Jetpur, was arrested and detained under the Ingress into India Ordinance in Mahang Son, a town located in the mountainous region of the Salween province in northern Siam, that's circled here. Upon arrest, Sidi was immediately deported to Rangoon and confined in the Moulmein jail, which is on the opening slide, where he would remain without charge for much of the next 2 years. He'd been living along the border region between Burma and Siam for nearly a decade. He arrived in Rangoon in 1907 at the age of 11, following his father and his elder brothers, Muhammad, Ismail, and Umair, who were there to expand their family cloth business. Sidi moved first to Loikau in the northern Kaya state, where Umair had a cloth shop, then to Wathet, where Muhammad and Ismail kept a store, and then finally to Mahang Son, where he planned to set up and oversee another branch. The men lived relatively undisturbed, nurturing a flourishing business and making homes for themselves. Umair married a Burmese woman from Fort Stedman in the Shan States and had a child with her. And the other 2 men, one of the other men also reportedly had a family, although we don't know anything about what that meant. So after moving to Mahang Son, Sidi supposedly lost touch with his brothers. He had no business partner, no friends except for a coolie by the name of Bakir. And despite the lack of familial support, his business proved to be very profitable. He boasted that his shop in this very small town earned 1,000 rupees per month. In 1915, however, everything changed when consular authorities in Siam alleged that this family of shopkeepers were disaffected and their unrestricted freedom on the border of Burma and Siam was a source of danger, especially during the war. So in September 1914, as World War I entered its second month, fears of sedition and radicalism in the Eastern Indian Ocean were met with a growing legal force and intensity. Concerns about disaffected and seditious Indian men inspired new maritime and terrestrial border controls that extended from British-controlled India all along the Bay of Bengal into the mountainous regions of Burma and Siam. The commercial pursuits of the Qasim brothers and their entanglements with the British imperial security state, I'm arguing in this project, opens interesting ways to think about commerce, confinement, and colonialism as intimate familial practices. And I'm particularly interested in their mother, who's only actually mentioned once in this correspondence, and sort of how she was thinking about and dealt with the absence of her husband and her aunts. I want to just say a little bit about ordinances and the British imperial state. In the 1860s onwards, ordinances offered the British colonial government in India with new ways to expand its juridical, territorial, and maritime control. As Shubhankar Dam explains, ordinances bypassed the legislative process, but they were not exceptional forms of rule. They were signed by the Governor General, carried the weight of an act of Parliament, and were regarded to be a convenient and even preferred method of lawmaking, especially in times of emergency. The Ingress and the Foreigners Ordinance expanded the British imperial carceral state in unprecedented ways. The ordinances enlisted shipping companies and ship captains to watch for and report undesirable passengers. They authorized local police and magistrates to arrest and detain men without charge, often for months and years. Under the Ingress, men lost their property and businesses and were separated from their families and communities. The introduction of ordinances in India began at a gradual pace. From 1861 to 1914, the colonial government only signed 7 ordinances, but with the onset of World War I, World War I dramatically accelerated this process. Between 1914 and 1915, in the span of only 1 year, Lord Hardinge signed 12 ordinances, including the Ingress and the Foreigners Ordinance. As emergency legislation, the Ingress into India Ordinance and the Foreigners Ordinance were to have a short lifespan. They were to expire 6 months following the end of the war. But given India's position along the eastern and western Indian Ocean, officials insisted that the coastal regions were particularly vulnerable to threats from both abroad and from within. Due to escalating fears of Indian radicalism on the subcontinent and increasingly in Burma, in East Asian and Southeast Asian ports of call along the west coast of North America and beyond, the Foreigners Ordinance and the Ingress remained in effect for 7.5 years. Colonial officials used these ordinances frequently and forcefully to detain anyone suspected of anti-British activities, irrespective of whether their suspicions had any legitimate basis. Although it was the Punjab government that expressed their concerns about Punjabi immigrants returning from American, Canadian, or Chinese ports and pressed for a new law that would help authorities to track and restrict their movements, the ordinance dramatically expanded the imperial security state, first in Punjab and then elsewhere. So between 1915, just to give you 1 year, over 3,000 men in Punjab were imprisoned and restricted to their villages without charge. Indefinite detention was justified and rationalized in the broadest possible terms. Indian men thought to be associating with the Ghaddars or believed to be Ghadar sympathizers. The Ghaddars were, of course, a revolutionary anti-colonial group that started on the west coast of the US and Canada. Anyone suspected of being Ghadar sympathizers were imprisoned and confined to their villages, often for years, devastating labor prospects and family travel. But the Ingress was also enforced outside of Punjab. In 1919, 1,800 men and 183 women were to be released from prison in Madras. 7,200 men and 78 women were to have their sentences reduced. In December 1919, 42 people in Bengal were confined to their homes, and another 2,154 were placed under minor restrictions. So you might be asking, why is she citing all these statistics, given that she said that the statistics all tell us? 5 minutes. Okay, great. I get 5 minutes to explain. So Sunil Amrit has famously argued that more people traveled along the Bay of Bengal than the Atlantic Ocean. Between 1840 and 1940, he writes, approximately 28 million people crossed the Bay of Bengal in both directions. By the early 20th century, the rise of steam accelerated the movement in ways that connected India and Burma in new ways. Regular traffic across the Bay of Bengal and into the mountainous and unstable frontier regions between Burma and Siam proved to be especially troubling for colonial officials. Indian officials cautioned that this border was a flourishing site of sedition and radicalism. There were French stations located around, across Siam. There was also concern about German conspiracies and involvements with Indian troops. By the end of 1914, as authorities began enforcing the Ingress and the Foreigners Ordinance on ships and in ports to scrutinize Indians and foreigners who disembarked in Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, Indian men returning from North America, including those supposedly affiliated with the Guthers, started to actually enter or try to reach India through Siam and Burma. And so this became a really important context for anti-colonialism. And this is the context in which Sidi, Muhammad, Ismail, and Umar found themselves. So Sidi Qasim, Siddiq Qasim, who came to be known as Sidi Qasim, and his three brothers, left Jaipur at very different times, but they all ended up in these border regions that I highlighted earlier. And this just gives you a sense of the sort of scale and geography of their voyage. And I argue in the book that they were really trying to escape their caste professions as cattle breeders and herders, and that so in fact I was just at the British Library, and I found a reference to a Muhammad Qasim in 1892 in the Siam business directory. All these things get really exciting. And he was a cattle herder. And so part of what I'm really interested in is how these men are trying to escape their sort of caste protection as herders and as breeders through commerce. So I don't have time to tell you the rest of then what happens to them, but I will just end with a letter that they write to the police, to the political agent in their village. And what's interesting about this, I had my mother translate the Gujarati script, and in front of all of their names, it says Matwa, which is their caste. And so I'm interested in how this, despite being gone for so long, how their sort of class designation gets reinscribed through their signature. So in this heartbreaking letter that they write in 1919, they ask to be allowed to go back to Nihang Song to claim their property and to close up their business. Their letter offers a much needed insight into the devastating effects that the Ingress and the Foreigners Ordinance had upon the lives of Indian merchants and traders. They write, "We have been ruined by this action of the government under the Foreigners Ordinance, and our family members are practically starving, especially owing to high cost of living. We have always been and shall always remain loyal to the British government and have never done anything by words and deeds against the interests of the benign British government." Their arrest, as they saw it, was the outcome of backbiting of the rival traders at Mahang Son, including someone who worked for the Bombay Burma Trading Company. And they pleaded that if they weren't allowed to actually leave Jetport to go back to Siam, that their so-called coolie, who was holding their money and property there, and should be allowed to actually send it back to them. And although there were other men who were from the same region in Gujarat who were allowed to go back to Siam to collect their property and wrap up their businesses or to send others, the Qasim brothers were not allowed to go. Sidi took up employment in a cutlery shop. Muhammad and Ismail returned to their caste profession and kept buffaloes. All of them lived with their mother, Sarbai. So just to very quickly conclude, the Ingress into India Ordinance and the Foreigners Ordinance expanded the imperial carceral state with tragic consequences for the Qasim brothers. They lost their family business, their property, and their reputations as respectable merchants. Muhammad and Ismail's health diminished. Sidi spent almost 2 years in prison and another 8 months under surveillance. But the most tragic outcome was for Umar. At the age of 29, he'd been living in Burma most of his life. He was married to a Burmese woman from Fort Stedman, and together with her had a child. His wife and child were both deceased. Umar was left with no property, assets, or community. And the superintendent of Kathiawar police reported, "It is after an absence of about 15 years that he is almost a stranger here." Through incarceration, deportation, and deracination, the Ingress and the foreigners' ordinances transformed Indian merchants into foreigners and into enemies of the British Empire.
We're joined by a scholar who probably needs no introduction in this group, but Professor Laleh Khalili was until recently Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University of London, and most recently the author of Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula, which came out in 2020 with Versa.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank, like everybody else, I want to thank Christian, who is the god of utter and total organization. But I also want to thank Hatia and Shana to say thank you so much for having us here. It's so lovely to actually see old friends and meet new ones that I've known on Twitter for ages and now get to actually see them in person. Flesh, it's wonderful. It's also an incredible joy to be able to read the kinds of papers that were put up on the cloud for us to read, but especially to respond to the three that are written by people whose work has been hugely influential for me as well. So what I want to do here is I want to talk about some common themes in the discussions that you guys have had, and with things that jump out at me that you may not, some of you may directly address, others may not, but to me it seemed to be in conversation with one another, and finally end with one question for each of you, please. Okay. So it's a joy to read such amazing works that do overcome the conference title of Imaginary Divides, the Middle East and Africa, across empires, oceans and borders. These amazing essays roam across spaces, the Red Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Kutch, and the Western Indian Ocean, and show the intimate ways that life has flourished despite imperial forms of coercion, carcerality, and economic exploitation. They take seriously, and in fact, Doan Mawani directly quotes Pearson's call to use amphibious methods to understand movement, mobility, and connections. And for that reason, they're also in conversation with the panel before, and I'm sure with the panel after as well. These works, like our previous panels, are dialogic. Tia talked about it's not only X, but it is also X. I think we can also talk about it is both X and Y. That is one of those things that these works do really well. Or in the terminology that we use in various disciplines and across the academy, they're in conversation, or they're in entangled, or they're mutually constitutive, they're mutually co-present, or indeed in that really old terminology, they're dialectical. Ways of understanding of mobility and stuckness, of liberty and repression, of legal exceptions and the ordinary force of law, of revolutionaries and empire, of the licit and illicit, of coastal and transoceanic trade, of visibility and invisibility, in this instance of the ports or the enslaved or incarcerated revolutionaries, ordinary itinerant folks, of coalition warships even that are often invisible when you're going by them because they turn off their AISs. And of course of spaces of trade and securitization, and finally of course of land and sea. These things are constantly in conversation with one another, and they do influence each other, they mutually constitute each other, they transform one another. In Dua's work, we find the development of ports infrastructures on the Red Sea that emerge in response to shifts in the locus of capital, but also in the interconnections between smaller and larger ports and container freight and dhow transport. And the role then that checkpoints, not checkpoints, although checkpoints, choke points, and conduits of flow, sort of oceanic or maritime routes of trade function to feed into or away from these ports. We find that choke points are at once spaces of flow and blockage, and that the attenuation of circulation works to maintain a lot of existing power relations, but also create very new ones in ways that perhaps feeds also into thinking about the shifting of global imperial control from the North Atlantic to other locations. For Hopper, British imperial hegemony in the Indian Ocean in the 19th century, I mean before that as well, but particularly in the 19th century, translates into epistemic control and physical coercion of populations who were trafficked between East Africa, Indian Ocean islands, and the Arabian Peninsula. And I will talk a little bit about what I mean by this epistemic control as well as holding in the next section. Mawani recounts how imperial laws propagated by the British in India were intended to structure, police, surveil, and monitor the circulation of mobile populations, whether they were sailors, demobbed soldiers, the aspirants returning, traders, merchants, and certainly revolutionaries. So these are works that are really in conversation with one another, but some of the themes that jumped out, and forgive me because they are themes that I'm really interested in, so I'm going to enforce that on you guys. The first of these three things, these are first legal categories, the second is the role of political economy, and the third is carcerality. So with the legal categories, one of the things that struck me was the extent to which legal categories have this very material force of being able to shape very material, political, social relations. So for example, Hopper talks about captives being transported versus slaves. These are all legal categories versus indentured peoples versus quote unquote coolies. But indeed, versus free and unfree, and these legal categories, in some ways, impose a particular set of treatments that probably, from the viewpoint of those liberated Africans, are not actually all that different. Because I think that a state of intention for 7 to 14 years in conditions that are probably not incredibly warm and cuddly and friendly is probably pretty damn hard to live through. As Christina Sharp writes, and as I was reading Hopper's article, it reminded me of Christina Sharp in The Wake. There's a portion where she's talking about the movement of migrants across the Mediterranean and the way and their deaths. And she talks about this as the afterlife of slavery, the wake of slavery. And she talks about, and this is a quote, the addition of the word human to cargo does nothing to ameliorate the ghosting these ships do of transatlantic slavery or the afterlives of slavery or the afterlives of property. And so in some ways, this idea that this human cargo is an echo of, is a reflection of, is a mirror to something else, was really striking to me. Going back to the legal categories, Dua talks about piracy, which itself is a legal category because it imposes questions of legality and somebody else's laws on what counts as being thievery or stealing or looting or whatever. But also the idea of smuggling, licit and illicit, which has appeared in his work throughout, and also citizenship categories. One of the other things that it was interesting for me was also the way that geographic and topographical categories end up actually becoming legal ones. So the idea of a choke point, the idea of flow versus blockage, and the reason that a choke point can become a legal category is precisely because the coalition warship is not the only one that is checking up on you. The Djibouti port control tends to be one of the noisiest and most involved of the port control places you go to. That choke point control over that sort of straddling that choke point gives them a legal kind of power that otherwise they would not have had. And finally, with Mawani, I actually don't even have to talk about categories of law because she's, in fact, the work is very directly about categories of law used to make and control movements. And in particular, what was interesting to me was the ways in which the British had the cojones to come and define what a foreigner was in India. And it was, of course, people that were, from there. But also questions of what counted as a trader or a vagabond, which is, of course, also comes from the enclosure processes in Britain itself, where ordinary people moving from one location to another, itinerant people, whether or not they were doing it for work or for life, were considered to be vagabonds. And then entire laws were created that made them into a proletarian as subjects. But then also, Mawani also talks about questions of quarantine as carceral mechanisms for control and surveillance of traveling Indians, which of course we have seen also during the COVID pandemic. So this all seems to me, in this instance, it seems to be that law is being grafted upon existing forms of jurisdiction. Fahad Bishar's work on an earlier period in the Indian Ocean really mentions this, but also grafting of law onto existing forms of injustice. In the case of Mawani caste being really important. Sorry if I was typing away furiously I was trying to make sure that I brought up some of the points that jumped out at me during the talks, which I didn't necessarily notice as I was reading. So that's the legal categories that are important. The second thematic, which I thought was really fascinating, and it came out, whether or not explicitly or not, was the question of political economy of the transoceanic trades. And here I wanted to invoke Cedric Robinson, because one of the things that in reading his racial capitalism, that like in his Black Marxism, comes across is the way that he conceptualizes the idea of racial capitalism as emerging out of a process of mobility, as a process of emerging control over mobile subjects. And he begins by talking about the people who ended up working as mercenaries, the Slav and Irish mercenaries, but also Slav and Irish workers. And so, and racial capitalism emerges in as this process of control. And he mentions that the migration and mobility were crucial to this. Again, this seems to me to be incredibly significant and central to both to all three of the works here. In part because Robinson's insistence on thinking about mobile peoples as the basis of development of ways of categorizing political subjects in racialized ways makes it so easy for capitalism to co-opt these folks into processes of exploitation. One of the things that was interesting to me was that Hopper, of course, talks about the movement, the forcible movement of the supposedly liberated Africans into different places, and particularly to Seychelles. And for me, what was interesting was that this was not only about enforcement of scientific racism, which was at this moment at its height, but also this was a moment of imperial economic exploitation of the Indian Ocean at its height. Seychelles was a place where copra, dry coconut, and sugar plantations existed. And so they needed labor, much the same way that the indentured labor was originally moved to the Caribbean in order to displace the people that had revolted for their own liberation and had acquired it through those revolts. The indentured labor was supposed to be taken to the Caribbean in order for them to do that. And I think that this was in an instance as well where the British used interceptions into ships carrying enslaved folks from East Africa as a way of ensuring that they had enough labor for their own plantations in Seychelles, but other locations. So that to me was really quite significant. Dua, of course, talks about the interconnectedness of container freight and dough travel. Not necessarily that they're alternatives, but that they're actually mutually constitute each other. The interconnectedness also of the Red Sea ports and the Gulf ports, and again, this going back historically across quite a long time, but also in contemporary moments. And of course, in his broader work about the ways in which piracy racializes certain subjects, and in racializing them allows for particular control over them, which also gives securitized control over entire areas. Finally, Mawani, in thinking about the legal processes which the imperial state used to control itinerant workers, is also talking about the disruptions to the lives of imperial subjects in ways that there's very little attention often given very little attention. You mentioned somewhere, which was really quite heartrending, is that we don't know the names of these thousands and thousands of people that were incarcerated. You don't know their fates. And of course, this is extremely familiar from other, we don't know also the names of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people that were killed in the various, that died in the various kinds of famines engineered by imperial control. So to me, that was also really interesting. This is a question of political economy, as well as, of course, racism, as well as, of course, law. And finally, the interconnection of carcerality and circulation really comes out in all three of the discussions. Because if we think about carcerality as a form of circulation, as present in the form of securitization, then all three are actually talking about this. Now here I want to quote, and I had quote this passage ad nauseum, but I love it because I think that in some ways it is a really quite useful way of thinking about this. Foucault in his Security, Territory and Population has a section where he's talking about the emergence of public health, public hygiene processes. And in them, he talks about how significant policing was to circulation. He says, finally, the last object of police is circulation, the circulation of goods, of the products of men's activity. This circulation should be understood, first of all, in the sense of the material instruments with which it must be provided. Thus, police will be concerned with the condition of developments of roads and with the navigability of rivers and canals and the seas, etc. So the space of circulation is a privileged object for police. And to me, of course, that is fascinating because there's a lot of thinking about the sea, which sees it as this kind of a free space. But of course, we know that even the idea of free trade upon the sea or free legal access to the sea is actually just, it's free for some people and not for others. And it actually introduces policing. So we see in all three authors' writings, policing routes of trade, policing routes of movements, policing routes of slave traffic. And if I may transfer this to the academy, we also see this happening to the policing of disciplines and geographic boundaries, which this very welcome conference is trying to challenge, both on sea and on land. This boundary crossings, this crossing of divides, this is a really incredibly hackneyed way to finish this before I move on to the questions, but I'm going to do it anyway. This boundary crossing, this crossing of divides means our works will be messier and less rigorous in the way my mainstream political scientist colleagues don't like. It will be less complete and more complicated, but it will also be a much better mirror or venue or vessel, as the case may be, of understanding. So on that note, I'm going to go to three questions for Matthew. The political economy of liberated Africans. How does the story of liberation fit within the broader discourse, and not only of abolition, but also of imperial expansion? I was really, really curious as to, obviously you talk about how, you know, there was probably a lot of self-congratulation in the writings of these folks, the missionaries and others. Is there also thinking about how this actually fits in the broader discourses of empire? For Jatin, one of the questions that I have is the reason that Djibouti ended up becoming this kind of a major node over Bosasa, for example, which actually has a better location. Perhaps it needs better harbor dredging, but it has a better location. What accounts for Djibouti being chosen? Is it the fact that they brought in every single military from every single corner of the world? Security and commerce? And finally, for Renissa, I'm curious about the mechanics of detention and incarceration, because you did mention that there were some detention camps, but that also people were sometimes put under house arrest. So how was this surveilled? How did they how did the British enforce this? To what extent were ships' captains and crews? Because I think you mentioned at some point that they were enlisted, whether or not they wanted to, into the job of sort of surveilling these traveling itinerant subjects. To what extent was there pushback from them against this? So thank you very much, and thank you for letting me come up.
Go for it, guys.
I'll just respond very quickly to that important question. Yes, I think the anti-slave trade campaigns in the Western Indian Ocean does both. It is meeting certain perceived labor needs. So the moving of liberated Africans from places like Zanzibar to Durban, exclusively right for purposes of labor. And this also produces envy in Cape Town, which originally was one of the main destinations for liberated Africans, who then were used in the vineyards in Stellenbosch and around Cape Town. And they're seen as ideal laborers for, and are very much mixed, because now the captures are all being taken to Zanzibar. They're quite envious. So there's a petition of Stellenbosch planters and plantation owners and vineyard owners asking for more liberated Africans. So there definitely are perceived labor needs being met by liberated Africans. as important in Mauritius as well as in Seychelles and elsewhere. But it's also, you mentioned self-congratulatory, absolutely. In fact, I mean, the historiography of Zanzibar makes very clear. That is really the sense or reason that the British are in Zanzibar, right, is to end the East African slave trade. So that's the whole reason they declared a protectorate in 1890. It's their focus, and of course, it's justifying their imperial expansion in East Africa as well as in the Gulf. So yeah, I think you're spot on.
Thank you for those comments and the question. So in a way, I mean, much similar to as you and your work also highlight, right? Look, we imagine that logistics is really about this coordination system where location is so key and location is destiny. But then we see the rise of Dubai over Aden, and you know, which clearly on a locational perspective doesn't have a lot to say, and as you highlight, has a lot to do with the way DP World comes in. And in the case of Djibouti, I think a lot of it was initially the French wanted, there was this sense like we must have an empire, and since there was Italian Somaliland, British Somaliland, one needed a French Somaliland that had some access to water. So lo and behold, Djibouti became French Somaliland, right? And so it is the terminus of the railroad, and then it is essentially with the in many ways with the kind of slow decline of Aden that it becomes even more important, and the rise of Eritrea. But at some point, in especially this more recent sort of securitization of Djibouti, just seems to be the Saudis are there, so the UAE must be there too. You know, AFRICOM. The minute AFRICOM sort of steps up, then all these other imperial presences feel like one must be in Djibouti because that's what having empire means, having bases, and Djibouti has very much kind of like become the place where you can have a base, and it provides you with the logistical connection of the airport. There is a Chinese-built railroad now that connects Ethiopia to Djibouti, so also Ethiopia losing its ports. So there are some of these broader geopolitical reasons, but it also seemed at some level it was just, this is what empires do. To be a good empire in Africa means to have a presence in Djibouti because you can't be one without it. So it's like this almost like fetish of like, you know, like, yeah, if you're a millionaire, you must buy a certain car. If you're any empire worth its name must have a little base in Djibouti. So
thank you so much for your comments and for your question. I guess I'll answer your question about the mechanics of detention restoration by just saying that my sense is that the ingress into any ordinance and the foreigners ordinance being build on a much longer sort of set of legal introductions into colonial India by the British that are really about facing people in space, right? It's about limiting the movements of people, and I'm thinking of the Criminal Tribes Act, but other legislation as well that offers a kind of blueprint or some seeds to these ordinances that are then justified because of the Great War. And so the men who are actually confined to their villages have to go and report every day to the police or the local magistrate. And that, of course, means taking time out of work, family, religious practices. But the interesting thing about the ship captains and crews and the way that they're enlisted into surveillance, I mean, part of this is that police forces just cannot surveil the number of ships that are moving, you know, whether it's across the Bay of Bengal or elsewhere. And they're particularly frustrated by the lack of personnel and the lack of ability to actually monitor who's moving on, you know, even like small scale boats, and to be able to find these or determine who is a dissident and who is a legitimate traveler. And so my sense is that, I mean, I haven't been able, it's not like there are sort of archival descriptions of what is happening. There are these suggestions that ship captains and crews have to submit their manifests in advance of disembarkation, for example, but my sense is that there was a lot of things happening that were under the radar, and part of that was because people weren't going to report. Part of it was also because the British just didn't have the personnel in police forces or even in the military to actually do the kind of accounting that they wanted to do. And so my sense is that the numbers would have been much larger than they were. But just to sort of end with one point, I found it really when I started working on this topic, I found it really curious when I would hear about the unprecedented nature of anti-terrorism legislation in the early 2000s, because it's like, no, this is happening in empires all over, and the British were very good at creating a kind of legal scaffolding that is being repurposed and recirculated in other places. And so I think the point that you made about the ports, Jethan, and about what did the sort of the sort of top 20 ports look like in the 15th century, and what do they look like now? Is it really a shift to a new world order, or is it a reemergence of another set of constellations of global power?
Yes, I'll be the person. Yes, Professor Peter Veen from University of Maryland. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for a wonderful panel. But I have one question to Matthew, and then a second question, which is to both Renis and to Matthew. The question to Matthew is about citizenship and what happens to the liberated Africans once they land and melt into the empire in some way, because it's the time also when citizenship regimes are established around the world. So I'm wondering how it affects the legal existence of these people. And the other question, which is a broader question, is about archives. Because this morning we heard from Rosie and from Mattia as well, I think, about archival silences and silencing. So I was wondering if you could tell us the story of your archives, and where and what and how, and also in terms of Anne Stoller's archival grain, how that influenced the telling of your stories. Thank you very much.
My God, thank you for asking that question. So I guess I'll just start by saying that I guess now more than a decade ago, I wrote an essay called Lost Archive, which is really trying to think about why it is that fields like anthropology and history have thought so deeply about what the archive is, and yet legal historians haven't actually problematized the archive at all. And that, archival work in legal history is really quite extractive and very different than what has been happening in other fields. And so when I was thinking about sort of how to organize this book, I think I am actually going to organize it around Law's Archive. And so part of it, one of the arguments I make is that we see this kind of double logic of violence, so violence of law and the violence of Law's Archive, which is about a kind of erasure. And so that's going to be the sort of framing of this book, but the last chapter is going to focus on the man's mother, who is only mentioned once. And I should say, by the way, that I'm working with a case of 93 pages that is from the British Library, although I've been doing work in other archives, including the National Archives in Delhi. And so the book is also very much an experiment in writing, and is really influenced by the work of people like subaltern studies and Spivak in particular, some of her earlier writing, and trying to put that into conversation with more recent work coming out by people like Saidiya Hartman, and thinking about what does it mean to write between these erasures and these fabulations.
I'll just very quickly along the same lines. The archives for this project are at essentially the 10 places where liberated Africans are taken. So Cape of Good Hope in Mauritius, or the early period. where the archival records are quite rich. The registers of liberated Africans are primary source, and those list people's individual names, sometimes give you a hint about their origins. There'll be this awkward caste that's a legacy of British colonialism in India. There'll be this category of caste, by which they mean Malagasy or Sefi usually. And then the Seychelles, as well as records for Mombasa and Zanzibar. And then missions, so the Church Missionary Society is the big one. And then hopefully at some point, the Good Shepherd Convent, the records are actually in France. So anyway, this will mean a lot of moving around in order to see all of these. But the records are quite rich. I will just say for the Seychelles, it's the only one of those 10 locations where the registers of liberated Africans don't just include the name, as well as the other conventional categories of sex and height and inches, and also have photographs. So each of the liberated Africans taken after about 1871 is individually photographed. And so you have these really, they're really difficult photographs because they're very often children, clearly not consenting to be photographed, but they're basically like a mugshot. And these registers of liberated Africans function, they have two purposes. One is to reward the naval officers who capture these ships prize money, which is determined by the count of people who are on board. So there's that, but also as a method of surveillance. And what better method of surveillance for people who might abscond from their indentures? I mean, very detailed descriptions of people's scarifications, brands, and in the case of Seychelles, even photographs of what people look like. So there's a group of us who had this conference in the fall, hosted by Stanford, wrestling with this issue. What do you do with these documents that basically have effectively biometric information, and people are in digital humanities now making these things broadly available? What are the ethics of that? So that's something that a number of us are wrestling with for an upcoming journal issue. And then your first question about citizenship, I thought of it mainly since it's mostly a 19th century story in terms of subjecthood. So just as a quick anecdote, there is one of these liberated Africans who ends up on a British Royal Navy vessel during the First World War and ends up jumping ship in New York City. And then later in the 1930s, uses the fact that he is a British subject because he was taken off a slave ship by the British Royal Navy as justification for his ability to relocate from New York to Zanzibar, which he wants the British government to help pay for, so he can effectively relocate back to the place where he was born in East Africa. So they are consciously aware of their subjecthood as British subjects in these Indian Ocean ports that are controlled by the British. The question would be then for descendants, what does that mean in terms of citizenship in the 20th century? And I hope to be able to trace that story. I can't yet, but I will let you know.
Thank you all. Really fascinating papers. I have a question for Jonathan and Matthew. Jonathan, Djibouti kind of looms large in Ottoman history. So before it was French Djibouti, it was Ottoman Ethiopia. Particularly though, it wasn't Djibouti, it was Zaida. So part of the construction of Djibouti identity, when I was doing interviews, was about this kind of connection of Zaila as semi-Ethiopian, semi-Turkish, the way they construct it today. And that made me think about kind of like what the Turkish government is doing beyond just investment, which is kind of digging into history, imagined and otherwise, about their connection to that place and why they deserve to be there beyond the economic and the military. The picture that you showed of the giraffe is probably the first example I see of the Chinese trying to make any kind of historical connection to the place beyond saying that, one, we're not imperialists, which the Turks tried to say as well. But two, we're there for practical reasons to help people with this investment. So is there kind of a construction of historical argument for why China deserves to be there? That would be great if we can actually dig into. And Matthew, a lot of what the British were doing, which you already talked about, is kind of using the slave trade or using their policing the slave trade as a way of exerting imperial power in places that they otherwise would have very little to do. And at that time, of course, they're jucking up or butting up against another empire that was trying to kind of create the same thing. And they forced the Ottoman Empire essentially in the Red Sea to sign that deal or to sign the agreement that they would also stop trade. So how much of this actually gets extended north? I know you talked about a lot of the freed Africans kind of being resettled in different places in the south. How many of those freed Africans actually end up making their way north, where we start to see, even after the signing of the agreement to stop slave trade, a lot of them from Ethiopia particularly start to show up in places like Damascus, Crete, and Istanbul in the late 19th century as a way of kind of a compromise with the British government, where we would stop, we would kind of stop a lot of the ships that had Ottoman flags on them, but a lot of the same people would end up actually somehow making their way up to Ottoman lands. So I don't know if you can shed some light.
Thank you. Yeah, and one of the reasons, so when the French come in, Zeila is the main hub in the area, and part of what the French do not want to do is or what they end up doing through the boats, the railroad, is displacing some of the cargo traffic that's going between, to Zeila, that's going on the caravan trades, right? So the railroad is also a moment of displacement from caravan trade to the trains and to this new port of Djibouti that they construct. And one of the fascinating things is precisely as you mentioned, like, with Turkish presence all throughout the Horn of Africa, even in Somalia, there's a kind of and it was really fascinating seeing the shifts. At one point, it was the Gulen-led business elites who used this history, and then after the kind of crackdown, all of a sudden the Turkish government, that shifts, but this continued sort of Ottoman, post-Ottoman understanding of we have been here before, we're simply back here, whether it's through giving Quranic scholarships for Somali students, as well as like the way the sort of physical landscape of Djibouti city mentions this Ottoman past, and part of what is fascinating is because the French definitely wanted to erase that Ottoman past and sort of say that French Somaliland, unlike what the Italians had in the Benedile, which was really just completely kind of morphed onto what were the original seats of power, French Somaliland was seen as creating a different geography, and part of the Turkish presence doesn't. And similarly, so there is the Malindi giraffe is one mode in which history kind of as securitizing Chinese investments come in, and then there's this fascinating way in which around the island of Lamu in northern Kenya, when the Chinese built port, they were, and here it goes back to a certain kind, genetic testing. There's a small island in called Shanga, which is renamed, which is sort of reimagined as being linked somehow to Shanghai. Of course, Shanghai is historically, but there are these genetic tests that are done amongst the Shanga communities, and they discover Chinese ancestries, and the Chinese government pays for scholarships for students who are Chinese Kenyan to go to China and to go to medical school and others, as well as around funding underwater archaeology in Kenya around the presence of Chinese vessels, because so much of this, of course, was there's a lot of porcelain coming on Omani boats, right? So you did not have like the Indian Ocean trade always sort of hopped from place to place. You didn't have these very long transoceanic voyages, and so the new Center for Underwater Archaeology in Mombasa is insistent on finding and discovering Chinese shipwrecks, and as a mode of then determining this physical presence. So yeah, I mean, there've been people written on of course, the neo-Ottoman moment in the Horn of Africa, but there is a way in which this claiming of an Indian Ocean history is also one that is not simply about rediscovering connection, but rather kind of making a certain claim about imperial presence.
Okay, I think we're just gonna take one super last quick question, right here in the front, I'm gonna make you guys answer like rapid round, because it's really lunchtime.
All right. So my name is William. I'm the chairman of Intelligence Working Together. And one of the main things that my organization does is build relationships so that we can decrease cultural gaps. Right. And so going back to the focus of the forum, right, the imaginary divides is that in our research, in our practice, what we found is that the divides are not imaginary, they're more reinforced than anything. They're reinforced based on interpersonal ignorance, failure for resolution, and the lack of inclusion of people that are having discussions about people without actually including the people that they're having discussions about. So based on the information that we gather here, how can we take that information and employ it in the public so that we can decrease and defeat these divides that we say, or if they are in fact imaginary, then how does this information help us to defeat those divides?
Hey, I'll just start with something that's oftentimes part of this larger project is trying to understand, and it's something many have written about, including Lale's work, that so much of our world is deeply connected to maritime trade, and yet those kinds of very real connections are invisible. So what are the consequences of that? Beyond simply not knowing the connections, it also means that the labor of people who are on ships, the kinds of hierarchical, racialized, and exploitative labor regimes get invisibilized, disappear in questions around, delay or like logistics, so the kind of Amazon story, right? We don't know. So one is to ask, like, what might happen when we make these kinds of things legible and present, and in ways that seem far away from the places where we're talking about. And there isn't that. Think about also like what kinds of distancing is required to say that, oh, shipping is something that happens there and doesn't have its resonances here. So that would be, I guess, my take on.
And I guess I would say that many of the people that I've been writing about are, didn't see themselves as sort of fixed in space. We're constantly moving around, irrespective of whether they are Sunni or Shia or Hindu or Christian. They lived in very often, in sort of communities that were where they shared business practices and even sort of religious signifiers. And so I think that much of the way we think of the world is about, borders and passports and citizenship and caste and religious distinctions, which are, as we see, a really intense place of violence. And, I think it might be useful to sort of reimagine how we think of the world and how we think of ourselves in the world, that people were always moving around and that they weren't fixed in space. And if we move from thinking of ourselves as citizens or nationals, I know this is really about an imaginary. It really is about, rethinking our way of being in the world. I'm not saying that states are going to eliminate borders, even though I would be very happy with that. But, I do actually think that it has a profound shift on how we imagine ourselves in relation to others.
I would just add that I think one of the ways that these divisions are reinforced is through a lot of denial and hand washing, and people sort of assuming that, wow, I'm not a part of this history. And I think it's important for us to cast our gaze on even those abolitionists, right, who themselves, they weren't advocating for equality. They were advocating for the end of slave trade. They're advocating for the end of slavery, but they're not advocating for equality. They themselves, even the abolitionists, held deeply held racist ideas about Africans. So I think it's important to shed some light on that period as well. Because I think too often we forget that This was a very long process. Actually, this connects a little bit to your question that I've seen in the League of Nations records from Geneva. 1922, there were slave house being captured in the Red Sea, and the Committee of Experts on Slavery is even suggesting, as I think as late as 1926, that perhaps aircraft should be used to spot slave ships in the Red Sea. And so it helps us remember that these are much longer processes, that abolition doesn't happen in a moment, right? It's this long drawn out process that involves many of these issues that we're still wrestling with today, including anti-Black racism.
Okay, with that, I think I'll thank you all for your time. I thank our panelists for the discussion.